The Metropolitan Courthouse of Washington, D.C. hummed with its usual Monday morning chaos, lawyers shuffling papers, defendants whispering to attorneys, and court officers maintaining a semblance of order. Judge Eleanor Harrington's courtroom had a reputation for efficiency and no-nonsense proceedings, which made the current scene all the more unusual. Marcus Johnson sat alone at the defense table, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had navigated difficult situations his entire life. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, his silver-rimmed glasses rested comfortably on the bridge of his nose, and his expression remained neutral as he reviewed the documents before him. What made this particular morning different wasn't just that Johnson had declined representation, choosing instead to defend himself, but the palpable undercurrent of amusement emanating from the prosecution's table. Assistant District Attorney Richard Kellerman leaned toward Detective James Mercer, covering his mouth as he whispered something that made both men snicker. Officer Thomas Reynolds, who stood near the bailiff's station, rolled his eyes dramatically and made a twirling motion near his temple when Johnson wasn't looking. "Thinks he's Perry Mason or something," Reynolds muttered just loud enough for the first row to hear. The case itself was straightforward. Marcus Johnson had been arrested 2 nights ago after allegedly interfering with police business at a roadblock. The charges included obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct, all of which carried potential jail time if the prosecution pushed for maximum penalties. Judge Harrington entered, and the ritualistic "all rise" momentarily paused the mockery. As she settled into her chair and reviewed the docket, her eyes narrowed slightly at Johnson. "I see you're representing yourself, Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone neutral but carrying a hint of skepticism. "Are you sure that's wise?" Johnson stood, buttoning his jacket with one fluid motion. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe I can adequately represent myself in this matter." From the prosecution table came another poorly concealed snort of derision. Judge Harrington shot a warning glance in that direction before turning back to Johnson. "Very well, but I must advise you that representing yourself, particularly in a criminal matter, is rarely in a defendant's best interest." "I understand, Your Honor," Johnson replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to high-stakes conversations. "I'm prepared to proceed." Kellerman rose, straightening his tie with theatrical precision. "The state is ready as well, Your Honor." His voice carried the smug certainty of a man who believed victory was merely a formality. "Then let's begin," Judge Harrington said. "Mr. Kellerman, your opening statement." Kellerman approached the jury box with practiced ease, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about respect for law and order. 2 nights ago, at approximately 10:45 p.m., the defendant, Marcus Johnson, approached a police roadblock on Constitution Avenue. When officers explained the situation and asked him to take an alternate route, Mr. Johnson became belligerent, demanding to know why he specifically was being redirected. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. When officers attempted to defuse the situation, Mr. Johnson refused to comply with lawful orders. He became physically resistant when Officer Reynolds attempted to escort him away from the scene, resulting in a disturbance that diverted valuable police resources from their assigned duties. Kellerman turned, gesturing toward Johnson with a sweeping motion. "The evidence will show that Mr. Johnson believed himself above the law, that somehow the rules that apply to everyone else didn't apply to him. We will demonstrate that his actions that night were not just uncooperative, but deliberately obstructive to law enforcement performing their sworn duties." He returned to his seat with a satisfied smile, nodding almost imperceptibly to Detective Mercer. Judge Harrington turned to Johnson. "Mr. Johnson, your opening statement?" Johnson rose slowly, deliberately, his movements economical and precise. He approached the jury without notes, making eye contact with each member as he began to speak. Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, what Mr. Kellerman described sounds troubling. A citizen disrespecting officers, creating problems where none need exist. If that were what happened, I would understand your concern. His voice carried no defensiveness, no urgency, just calm certainty. But that's not what happened. The evidence will show that I approached a roadblock where other citizens were being waved through while I was stopped. When I politely asked for clarification, I was immediately treated with suspicion and hostility. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, his earlier smirk fading slightly. I never raised my voice, Johnson continued. I never resisted. I simply asked questions any citizen has the right to ask. The prosecution will not be able to produce any evidence of disorderly conduct because there was none. They will not be able to demonstrate resistance because there was none. What they will demonstrate, though perhaps unintentionally, is something far more troubling about how certain citizens are perceived and treated by those sworn to protect and serve. As Johnson returned to his seat, the courtroom had grown notably quieter. Judge Harrington studied him with newfound interest before turning to Kellerman. The state may call its first witness. The people call Officer Thomas Reynolds, Kellerman announced. Reynolds approached the stand with confidence bordering on swagger. After being sworn in, he settled into the witness chair, adjusting his uniform and looking expectantly at Kellerman. Officer Reynolds, please tell the court about your encounter with the defendant on the night of April 15th. Reynolds cleared his throat. We had set up a roadblock due to a suspicious package reported near the Treasury building. Protocol is to divert traffic while the bomb squad investigates. He glanced at Johnson with barely disguised contempt. Most people understand when we explain the situation, but Mr. Johnson immediately became confrontational. How so? Kellerman prompted. He demanded to know why he was being stopped when others weren't. He refused to take the detour, insisted on knowing who was in charge, and said we had no right to prevent him from proceeding. And how did you respond? Professionally, Reynolds stated firmly. I explained the security concern and the temporary nature of the roadblock. When he continued to argue, I asked him to step out of his vehicle. What happened then? He refused at first, kept asking questions about our authority, started recording with his phone. Reynolds shifted in his seat. When he finally did exit the vehicle, he ignored my instructions to step away from the roadblock. That's when I attempted to escort him back to his vehicle and he pulled away from me. Kellerman nodded, satisfied. And that's when you placed him under arrest? Yes, for his safety and ours. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Harrington turned to Johnson. Your cross-examination, Mr. Johnson. Johnson approached the witness stand with unhurried confidence. Reynolds straightened as if preparing for battle. Good morning, Officer Reynolds. Morning, Reynolds replied curtly. You testified that I immediately became confrontational, is that correct? Yes. Could you please tell the court my exact words when you first approached my vehicle? Reynolds blinked. I don't recall your exact words. You don't recall, yet you're certain I was immediately confrontational? Your tone was confrontational. My tone, Johnson repeated thoughtfully. Officer Reynolds, were your body cameras functioning that evening? A flicker of unease crossed Reynolds' face. Yes. Has that footage been entered into evidence? Kellerman rose quickly. Your Honor, the footage is being processed. We haven't had sufficient time. Officer Reynolds has had sufficient time to form detailed impressions about my tone, Johnson interjected. Surely the actual recording would be more reliable than memory? Judge Harrington's gaze sharpened. Mr. Kellerman, where is this footage? We can have it by tomorrow, Your Honor. See that you do. She turned back to Johnson. Continue your cross-examination. Thank you, Your Honor. Johnson returned his attention to Reynolds. You mentioned that I was stopped while others were allowed through. How many vehicles passed through while I was detained? Reynolds hesitated. Several. We weren't stopping everyone, just conducting random checks. Random checks during a bomb threat response? We were using discretion. I see. And what criteria informed this discretion? Reynolds shifted again. Suspicious behavior. Vehicles that matched certain profiles. What profile did my vehicle match? It's a standard government-issue sedan. Not the vehicle per se. Reynolds trailed off, suddenly aware of the hole he was digging. Then what criteria specifically led to my vehicle being one of the few stopped that evening? Kellerman stood again. Objection, Your Honor. Officer Reynolds can't be expected to recall the specific reasoning for each traffic stop. I believe Officer Reynolds just testified that this wasn't a routine traffic stop, but a security measure, Johnson countered. Surely the criteria for potentially life or death security decisions are clear and consistent. Judge Harrington studied both men. Overruled. The witness will answer the question. Reynolds cleared his throat. As I said, we use our training and experience to identify potential concerns. And what about me or my vehicle raised concerns? The silence stretched uncomfortably before Reynolds finally answered. You were driving slowly, looking around. It seemed suspicious. I see, Johnson said quietly. One last question, Officer Reynolds. When you approached my vehicle and saw me, before any words were exchanged, what did you notice about me? Reynolds frowned. I don't understand the question. It's straightforward. What did you observe about me personally when you first approached my window? I observed an uncooperative individual. Before I spoke, Johnson clarified. What did you see? The courtroom had grown so quiet you could hear the wall clock ticking. Reynolds swallowed, suddenly aware of the trap. A middle-aged black male, he finally said. Johnson nodded once. Thank you, Officer Reynolds. No further questions. As Johnson returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted perceptibly. The smirks from the prosecution table had vanished, replaced by tense whispers between Kellerman and Detective Mercer. Judge Harrington was watching Johnson with newfound intensity, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. The state calls Detective James Mercer, Kellerman announced, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. Detective Mercer approached the stand, his testimony largely corroborating Reynolds' account while carefully avoiding the pitfalls his colleague had stumbled into. Throughout his testimony, Johnson remained impassive, taking occasional notes but otherwise giving no indication of his thoughts. When the afternoon session resumed, the mood in the courtroom had transformed. The morning smugness from the prosecution table had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. Spectators who had wandered in expecting a routine case now leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Detective Mercer had been excused after Johnson's surgical cross-examination exposed inconsistencies in the timeline of events, particularly regarding when the call about a suspicious package had actually come in versus when the roadblock had been established. The state calls Officer Patricia Chen, Kellerman announced, his voice tight with the strain of a case rapidly unraveling. Officer Chen took the stand with military precision. Unlike Reynolds, her demeanor was strictly professional, her uniform immaculate, her responses measured. As the officer who had processed Johnson's arrest, she testified to his demeanor at the station: cool, uncooperative, and according to her notes, unnecessarily difficult. Could you elaborate on what made the defendant unnecessarily difficult? Kellerman asked. He refused to answer basic processing questions, Chen replied. He demanded phone calls to people he claimed were his colleagues but wouldn't specify who. He stated repeatedly that we were making a mistake that would have consequences. Did you interpret that as a threat, Officer Chen? Objection, Johnson said calmly. Leading the witness. Judge Harrington nodded. Sustained. Kellerman rephrased. How did you interpret those statements? Chen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. In my experience, individuals who emphasize consequences during processing are typically attempting to intimidate officers. Thank you, officer. No further questions. Johnson rose, buttoning his jacket again. Officer Chen, thank you for your testimony. I just have a few questions to clarify some points. Chen nodded stiffly. You mentioned that I refused to answer basic processing questions. Which questions specifically did I decline to answer? You wouldn't state your employer. I see. And did I explain why I was declining to provide that information? Chen paused. You said it was classified. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. And when I requested phone calls to colleagues, did I specify why I needed to contact them? You said it was a matter of national security, Chen admitted. But defendants often make exaggerated claims during processing. Of course, Johnson acknowledged. Let me ask you this. Did you run my identification through your database? Yes, standard procedure. And what did that search return? Chen's composure slipped for the first time. It returned limited information. Limited how? Your record showed a government security clearance that restricted access to your personal data. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder until Judge Harrington tapped her gavel lightly. Did that unusual result prompt you to contact anyone for clarification? I informed my supervising officer. And what did your supervising officer instruct you to do? Chen's discomfort was now obvious. He said to process you normally and that someone would sort it out in the morning. Someone would sort it out, Johnson repeated thoughtfully. One final question, Officer Chen. When you process individuals with government security clearances, isn't there a protocol requiring immediate notification of their employing agency? Yes, Chen admitted reluctantly. Was that protocol followed in my case? No, sir, it was not. Thank you, Officer Chen. No further questions. As Johnson returned to his seat, Judge Harrington's expression had shifted from professional detachment to active curiosity. She glanced at the prosecution table, where Kellerman was hurriedly conferring with an assistant who had just handed him a folder. Your Honor, Kellerman said, rising suddenly. May we approach the bench? Judge Harrington nodded, and both Kellerman and Johnson moved forward. Your Honor, Kellerman said in a hushed tone, we've just received information that requires immediate consideration. I believe we should request a brief recess. On what grounds? The judge asked. Kellerman glanced uncomfortably at Johnson. New information regarding the defendant's status has come to light. I'm standing right here, Counselor, Johnson said mildly. And I believe we're in the middle of a trial. Unless the state is prepared to dismiss all charges, I suggest we continue. Judge Harrington studied both men. Mr. Kellerman, either articulate your concern clearly or return to your table. Kellerman swallowed hard. Your Honor, we have reason to believe the defendant may be affiliated with federal law enforcement in some capacity. And you're just discovering this now, mid-trial? Judge Harrington's tone could have frozen flowing water. The initial processing didn't follow proper protocol, as Officer Chen just testified. The judge finished for him. Return to your tables, gentlemen. This trial will proceed. As they stepped back, the courtroom doors opened and 3 men in dark suits entered quietly, taking seats in the back row. Johnson glanced over his shoulder, giving them a nearly imperceptible nod before returning his attention to the proceedings. Does the state have any further witnesses? Judge Harrington asked. Kellerman, now visibly sweating, conferred briefly with his team. No, Your Honor. The state rests its case. Very well. Mr. Johnson, you may present your defense. Johnson stood. Your Honor, in light of the testimony we've heard, I move for a directed verdict of acquittal. The state has failed to establish the elements of any of the charged offenses. Judge Harrington considered this. While I'm inclined to agree with you, Mr. Johnson, I believe the jury deserves to hear your side of events. Will you be testifying on your own behalf? Yes, Your Honor. After being sworn in, Johnson took the stand. Unlike the previous witnesses, he carried no notes and required no preparation. He sat comfortably, as if the witness chair were his natural habitat. Please state your name for the record, Judge Harrington instructed. Marcus Alexander Johnson. Mr. Johnson, please tell the court in your own words what happened on the night of April 15th. Johnson nodded, his deep voice filling the courtroom without effort. I was returning from a late meeting at the Capitol. As I approached Constitution Avenue, I encountered what appeared to be a police checkpoint. I noticed that vehicles were being selectively stopped. Specifically, I observed that 3 vehicles driven by white individuals were waved through immediately before my car was signaled to stop. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. When Officer Reynolds approached my vehicle, his hand was already resting on his weapon, despite the fact that I had complied by pulling over and lowering my window. His first words to me were not an explanation, but a demand. License and registration now. Johnson continued, his recounting measured and precise. I provided my identification and asked why I had been stopped when others had been waved through. Officer Reynolds told me to stop asking questions and follow directions. When I politely insisted on knowing the reason for being singled out, his demeanor became increasingly aggressive. Did you at any point raise your voice or behave in a disorderly manner? Judge Harrington asked. No, Your Honor. My training specifically emphasizes remaining calm in confrontational situations. Your training? Judge Harrington inquired. Yes. De-escalation is a cornerstone of federal law enforcement protocol. The courtroom fell silent. Even the reporters who had been scribbling notes paused, pens hovering above paper. Johnson continued as if he hadn't just dropped a bombshell. When I was ordered out of my vehicle, I complied. When Officer Reynolds attempted to physically move me without provocation or legal cause, I did not resist but merely maintained my position. At no point did I obstruct their legitimate duties. I simply asserted my right to be treated with the same respect afforded to other citizens. Judge Harrington was studying Johnson with newfound intensity. Mr. Johnson, for clarity, are you employed in federal law enforcement? Yes, Your Honor, I am. Kellerman stood abruptly. Your Honor, if the defendant is claiming some sort of professional immunity, I'm claiming no such thing, Johnson interrupted calmly. I'm simply establishing that I'm intimately familiar with proper law enforcement protocols that were not followed that night. Continue, Mr. Johnson, the judge instructed. After my arrest, I repeatedly informed the officers that they needed to contact federal authorities. Those requests were ignored. When I was processed, I declined to specify my employer, as that information is classified at a level beyond what Officer Chen would have been authorized to access. I was then held overnight unnecessarily, despite having committed no crime. Kellerman, recovering somewhat, approached for cross-examination. Mr. Johnson, regardless of your employment, doesn't law enforcement need to establish control of a scene? Weren't the officers simply doing their job by insisting on compliance first and explanations later? In potentially volatile situations, yes, Johnson conceded. But a routine traffic stop where the citizen is being cooperative does not qualify. Furthermore, selective enforcement based on racial profiling is never appropriate. That's a serious accusation, Kellerman said, his tone hardening. Do you have any evidence beyond your personal perception that race played a factor in your being stopped? Besides the pattern of which drivers were waved through and which were stopped? Besides Officer Reynolds' admission that there was nothing suspicious about my government-issued vehicle? Besides the fact that the supposed suspicious package report came in 30 minutes after my detention began, according to dispatch records? Johnson's voice remained even, but his words landed like precision strikes. You've been monitoring dispatch records? Kellerman asked, thrown off balance. No, Counselor, my colleagues have. As if on cue, one of the suited men in the back row stood up and approached the bailiff, handing him a folder. The bailiff delivered it to Judge Harrington, who reviewed its contents with a deepening frown. Mr. Kellerman, she said finally, these records appear to contradict the timeline presented by your witnesses. Kellerman's face flushed. Your Honor, I wasn't aware. Clearly, the judge interrupted. Do you have any further questions for this witness? No, Your Honor, Kellerman said, defeated. Mr. Johnson, you may step down, Judge Harrington said. Do you have any other witnesses to call? No, Your Honor, the defense rests. Very well. We'll proceed to closing arguments. Kellerman's closing argument was a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of his case. Gone was the confident prosecutor who had started the day with smirks and certainty. In his place stood a man visibly struggling to reassemble the fragments of a shattered narrative. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice straining for conviction. Despite the complexities that have emerged during this trial, the fact remains that proper procedure matters. Even if Mr. Johnson is employed in federal law enforcement, a claim that, I remind you, was not verified prior to this proceeding, he is still bound by the same laws as every other citizen. Johnson watched impassively as Kellerman continued his floundering summation. Officer Reynolds and his colleagues were responding to a potentially dangerous situation. In such circumstances, immediate compliance is not just requested, it's required. Mr. Johnson's refusal to simply follow directions created an unnecessary confrontation. His behavior, regardless of his credentials, constituted obstruction. Kellerman paused, perhaps hoping for some sign of agreement from the jury, but found only skeptical expressions. The defense would have you believe that this case is about profiling, about bias, but I urge you to consider a simpler explanation. This was about a citizen who believed himself above the law, who refused lawful commands, and who created a disturbance that diverted resources from a potential security threat. As Kellerman returned to his seat, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The three suited men at the back had been joined by two more, their presence lending gravity to the proceedings. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, watched the proceedings with particular intensity. Johnson rose for his closing argument with the same measured calm that had characterized his entire defense. He approached the jury without notes, his gaze connecting with each member. Thank you for your attention throughout these proceedings, he began. As Mr. Kellerman suggested, this case is indeed about procedure, but not in the way he claims. Johnson paced slowly before the jury box, his hands clasped behind his back. This case is about what happens when procedures designed to protect citizens are selectively enforced based on how those citizens look. It's about what happens when officers decide, before a single word is exchanged, that some people deserve respect while others deserve suspicion. He paused, allowing his words to settle. The evidence has established several critical facts. I was singled out at a checkpoint where white drivers were waved through. I was confronted aggressively without provocation. When I civilly requested an explanation, I was treated as combative. When I identified myself as a federal agent, without specifying my position due to security protocols, that information was disregarded. Johnson gestured toward the prosecution table. Mr. Kellerman suggested that I believed myself above the law. On the contrary, I believe deeply in the law. I have dedicated my career to upholding it. What I object to is not the law, but its unequal application. His voice remained steady, but took on a resonance that filled the courtroom. The officers who detained me that night weren't enforcing the law equally. They were enforcing their preconceptions about who looks suspicious, who deserves respect, who deserves the benefit of the doubt. Johnson turned slightly, encompassing both the jury and Judge Harrington in his gaze. I don't stand before you seeking special treatment. I stand before you as a citizen asking for equal treatment, the same treatment afforded to the white drivers who passed through that checkpoint unchallenged, the same professional courtesy that would have been extended had I been recognized as a colleague rather than presumed to be a threat. As Johnson returned to his seat, the courtroom remained utterly silent. Judge Harrington allowed the moment to linger before addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the evidence and arguments in this case. It is now your responsibility to deliberate and reach a verdict on the charges of obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. Please remember that the burden of proof rests entirely with the prosecution. Unless they have proven each element of each charge beyond a reasonable doubt, you must find the defendant not guilty. As the jury filed out, the woman with silver-streaked hair approached the gallery railing and gestured to one of the court officers. After a brief exchange, the officer approached Judge Harrington and whispered something that made the judge's eyebrows rise. She glanced at the woman, then at Johnson, before nodding. "This court will take a brief recess," she announced. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kellerman, please approach the bench." When they did, Judge Harrington lowered her voice. "Gentlemen, I've just been informed that the director of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division is requesting a private conference in my chambers. Mr. Johnson, she specifically asked for your presence as well." Kellerman blanched. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "I'm aware, Counselor," Judge Harrington interrupted. "However, given the circumstances, I'm inclined to grant the request. We'll reconvene when the jury returns with a verdict." In the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was tense. Director Catherine Reynolds, a formidable woman whose reputation for tackling systemic abuses within law enforcement was well known in legal circles, wasted no time on pleasantries. "Judge Harrington, I apologize for this unusual intervention, but certain aspects of this case have raised significant departmental concerns." She turned to Johnson with a respectful nod. "Director Johnson, the Attorney General sends his regards and his apologies for this situation." Judge Harrington's composure slipped for the first time that day. "Director Johnson?" Marcus Johnson offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "Marcus Johnson, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for not making that clear earlier, Your Honor, but I wanted this case to proceed on its merits, not my title." The judge stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You're the head of the FBI, and you were arrested at a police checkpoint?" "Yes, Your Honor. Unfortunately, it's not the first time I've experienced such treatment when not immediately recognized." Director Reynolds interjected, "Judge Harrington, while we have no intention of interfering with your court's proceedings, I wanted to inform you that this incident has triggered an automatic civil rights investigation into the departmental practices of the officers involved." "I see," Judge Harrington said, regaining her composure. "And I assume you're aware that Director Johnson chose not to identify himself fully during his arrest?" "For security reasons," Johnson explained. "I was returning from a classified briefing. Standard protocol dictates discretion in such circumstances." "Regardless," Director Reynolds continued, "the pattern of selective enforcement documented in this case is consistent with concerns our division has been monitoring in this precinct for some time." Judge Harrington nodded slowly. "I appreciate your candor, Director Reynolds. However, there is still a jury deliberating on criminal charges. I cannot and will not dismiss those based solely on Director Johnson's position. We wouldn't ask you to, Johnson assured her. As I said in court, I believe in the system, even when it fails individual citizens. I want the jury to reach their verdict based on the evidence, not my title. Very well, Judge Harrington said. Let's return to the courtroom and see what the jury has decided. They had barely retaken their positions when the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The speed of their deliberations suggested a clear consensus. The foreperson, a retired schoolteacher with silver hair and a stern expression, stood as the verdict was requested. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of disorderly conduct, we find the defendant not guilty. Murmurs swept through the courtroom as Judge Harrington thanked and dismissed the jury. As the spectators began to disperse, she addressed Johnson directly. Director Johnson, while this court has found you not guilty of all charges, I believe an apology is in order, not from you, but to you. The treatment you received falls far below the standard our justice system should uphold for any citizen, regardless of position. Johnson nodded in acknowledgement. Thank you, Your Honor. If I may make one request? Of course. I would ask that Officer Reynolds and Detective Mercer remain for a moment. Judge Harrington considered this, then nodded to the bailiff, who intercepted the officers as they attempted to leave. They returned reluctantly to stand before the bench, their earlier swagger replaced by evident apprehension. Johnson approached them, his demeanor neither triumphant nor accusatory, simply resolute. The courtroom had emptied except for the suited agents at the back, Director Reynolds, and a few reporters who sensed that the real story was just unfolding. Officer Reynolds, Detective Mercer, Johnson began, his voice carrying in the now quiet space. I want to be clear about something. This case was never about me personally. Reynolds stared straight ahead, refusing to meet Johnson's gaze. Mercer at least had the dignity to make eye contact, though his discomfort was evident. I could have identified myself fully at any point during our interaction. I could have made a phone call that would have ended the situation immediately, but had I done so, we wouldn't be having this necessary conversation. Johnson clasped his hands behind his back, his posture straight but not intimidating. I've been the director of the FBI for 3 years. Before that, I spent 2 decades as a field agent, SWAT team leader, and eventually assistant director. Throughout my career, I've experienced what happened that night more times than I can count. Being singled out, presumed dangerous, treated with contempt rather than professional courtesy. The difference is that now I have the authority to do something about it, Johnson continued, his gaze steady. Not just for myself, but for every citizen who lacks the platform and position I have. Reynolds shifted his weight, the first crack in his rigid stance. Sir, if I had known who you were... That's precisely the problem, Johnson interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. Justice shouldn't depend on who someone is. The same respect, the same adherence to protocol, the same presumption of innocence should apply to everyone. Not just federal directors, not just people you recognize or relate to, but everyone. Mercer cleared his throat. Director Johnson, we were just following procedure for suspicious. Were you? Johnson asked, raising an eyebrow. Because according to the department's own guidelines, which I reviewed this morning, officers are explicitly instructed not to use race as a factor in determining which vehicles to stop at security checkpoints. Those same guidelines require officers to clearly state the reason for any detention immediately upon initial contact. Neither of those procedures was followed in my case. He took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly. The truly concerning part is that you both seem to find it amusing. The idea that a black man would dare to question your authority or know his rights. Reynolds flushed, unable to maintain eye contact. I saw the smirks in court this morning, Johnson continued. I heard the whispers, the jokes. You weren't just enforcing the law that night. You were enforcing a hierarchy, one where people like me aren't supposed to question people like you. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Judge Harrington, who had remained on the bench, was motionless, absorbing every word. Here's what's going to happen, Johnson said, his tone shifting to something more official. Director Reynolds and her team will conduct a thorough review of your department's practices. I'll be assigning a special task force from the Bureau to assist in that review. This isn't punishment, it's correction, an opportunity to identify and address patterns that may be invisible to those perpetuating them. Mercer swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Johnson studied both officers for a long moment. I believe in second chances, gentlemen. I believe in growth and learning. What I don't believe in is ignoring problems and hoping they'll solve themselves. He extended his hand, first to Mercer, then to a startled Reynolds. I look forward to seeing how you both contribute to the changes that need to happen. As the officers departed, visibly shaken, Director Reynolds approached Johnson with a look of quiet approval. Eloquent as always, Marcus, though I suspect some of your agents might have preferred a more forceful approach. Johnson smiled faintly. Force rarely changes minds, Catherine. It just drives beliefs underground where they fester. If we want real change, we need to create space for honest reflection. Judge Harrington descended from the bench and joined them. Director Johnson, I owe you an apology as well. I should have recognized the inconsistencies in the officer's testimony sooner. You followed the evidence where it led you, Your Honor. That's all any of us can ask from a judge. Johnson glanced at his watch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a press conference to prepare for. This case has attracted attention that we should address directly. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of reporters had gathered, alerted by courthouse insiders that something significant was unfolding. Johnson emerged, flanked by his security team, Director Reynolds at his side. Camera flashes erupted as he approached the microphone set up at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Good afternoon, Johnson began, his voice carrying across the assembled media. I'm Marcus Johnson, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I want to address the events that transpired today and their broader implications. The reporters, many of whom had just learned his identity, erupted with questions. Johnson raised a hand for silence. 2 nights ago, I was wrongfully detained and subsequently arrested by officers who made assumptions based on my appearance rather than my actions. Today, a jury rightfully acquitted me of all charges. But this isn't about my personal vindication. He paused, scanning the crowd. This is about a systemic issue that affects countless Americans every day. Citizens who don't have the benefit of my resources, my knowledge of the law, or my position. A reporter called out, Director Johnson, why didn't you identify yourself to the officers immediately? That's an excellent question, Johnson acknowledged. Had I done so, I would have experienced the privilege of rank rather than the reality faced by ordinary citizens. My position shouldn't determine how I'm treated under the law, and neither should anyone else's race, appearance, or background. Another voice shouted, Will there be consequences for the officers involved? This isn't about punishment, Johnson replied firmly. It's about improvement. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, in cooperation with the FBI, will be conducting a comprehensive review of departmental practices. Our goal isn't to assign blame, but to identify patterns and implement solutions. He continued, his voice gaining strength. The rule of law depends on equal application. When we allow bias, conscious or unconscious, to influence enforcement, we undermine the very foundation of justice. As the director of the FBI, I have a responsibility to address this issue, not just when it affects me personally, but whenever and wherever it occurs. As Johnson fielded questions, Chief Robert Mendoza of the Metropolitan Police Department watched the broadcast from his office, his expression grim. The phone on his desk had been ringing incessantly since the verdict was announced. Now, seeing the FBI director himself addressing the media about discrimination within his department, Mendoza knew a reckoning was coming. His secretary buzzed through. "Chief, the mayor is on line 1. He sounds concerned." Mendoza sighed heavily. "Tell him I'll call back in 5 minutes, and get Captain Lewis in here immediately." Across town, in a modest apartment in southeast D.C., Elijah Taylor sat with his grandmother, both transfixed by the image of Director Johnson on their television screen. Elijah, a law student who had experienced his own share of problematic police encounters, felt a surge of vindication seeing someone who looked like him speak truth to power from a position of authority. "That's how you do it," his grandmother said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You climb to the top, then you reach back down and pull others up with you." Elijah nodded, Johnson's words resonating deeply. "He didn't just win his case, Grandma. He's using it to change the system." Back at the press conference, Johnson was concluding his remarks. "This case has highlighted a persistent challenge in our justice system, but it has also demonstrated the system's capacity for self-correction. The jury today recognized the truth. Judge Harrington ensured a fair proceeding. These are the elements of justice working as they should." He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward slightly. "But we can't rely solely on individual cases to drive systemic change. That requires commitment at every level, from street officers to department chiefs, from prosecutors to judges, from lawmakers to citizens themselves." Director Reynolds stepped forward to join him. "The Department of Justice stands ready to work with law enforcement agencies nationwide to address these challenges. What happened to Director Johnson wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of broader issues that demand our attention and action." As the press conference concluded, Johnson's phone buzzed with a message. It was from the Attorney General. "POTUS wants to meet. Tomorrow 9 a.m. Oval Office." In the days that followed, the case became a national talking point. Cable news segments debated the implications. Social media exploded with opinions from all sides, and police departments across the country began examining their own practices with newfound scrutiny. At FBI headquarters, Johnson convened a meeting of his executive leadership team. The atmosphere was charged with purpose as they gathered in the secure conference room on the 7th floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnson began, "the events of this week have created an opportunity, one that we cannot afford to waste. The Bureau has long been committed to protecting civil rights, but now we need to lead by example in addressing the very issues that affect our communities." Assistant Director Sophia Chen, head of the Criminal Investigative Division, leaned forward. "What are you proposing, Director?" "A comprehensive initiative," Johnson replied. "I want to establish a new civil rights enforcement task force that combines our existing civil rights resources with additional personnel and technology. We'll develop enhanced training programs for law enforcement nationwide, create more robust reporting mechanisms for civil rights violations, and implement data analytics to identify patterns of discriminatory enforcement." Deputy Director Michael Reese nodded slowly. "This goes beyond the typical Bureau mandate, sir. It's ambitious." "It's necessary," Johnson corrected. "Our mandate is to uphold the Constitution and protect the American people. We can't fulfill that mandate if segments of our population don't trust the justice system, or worse, actively fear it." Executive Assistant Director James Wilson, a 30-year Bureau veteran, cleared his throat. "Sir, with all due respect, there will be resistance. Some departments will view this as federal overreach." "Undoubtedly," Johnson agreed. "Change is never comfortable, especially for those who benefit from the status quo. But our job isn't to make people comfortable, it's to ensure justice." As the meeting continued, strategies were developed, resources allocated, and timelines established. By the end, a framework had emerged for what would become the most significant civil rights initiative in the Bureau's recent history. The Oval Office possessed a weightiness that transcended its physical dimensions, a gravitas born from history and power. Johnson had been here many times during his tenure as FBI director, but this morning's meeting carried a different energy. The president sat behind the resolute desk, fingers steepled, as Johnson concluded his briefing on the courthouse incident and its aftermath. "So that's where we stand, Mr. President," Johnson said. "The Justice Department's review is underway, and I've initiated the framework for our new Civil Rights Enforcement Task Force." The president nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You could have avoided all this, Marcus. One phone call the night of your arrest, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." "With respect, sir, that's precisely why I didn't make that call," Johnson replied. "The ability to bypass the system with a phone call is exactly the problem. Justice shouldn't depend on who you know or what position you hold." A smile touched the president's lips. "And that's why I appointed you, against the advice of several advisors who thought you'd be too disruptive to the status quo." He rose from his chair, moving to the sitting area and gesturing for Johnson to join him. "You have my full support on the task force initiative, whatever resources you need." "Thank you, Mr. President. But I should warn you, this won't be popular in some quarters. Police unions are already mobilizing against what they're calling federal interference in local policing." The president waved away the concern. "I didn't take this job to win popularity contests, and neither did you. We both swore to uphold the Constitution for all Americans, not just the ones who look a certain way or live in certain neighborhoods." As Johnson left the White House, his secure phone buzzed with a notification. The National Association of Police Organizations had issued a statement expressing grave concerns about the FBI's proposed expansion into what they termed routine policing matters. Simultaneously, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had released their own statement praising the initiative as a long overdue acknowledgement of systemic inequities in law enforcement. The battle lines were being drawn exactly as Johnson had anticipated. By the time he reached FBI headquarters, requests for interviews had flooded in from every major news outlet in the country. Deputy Director Reese met him at the elevator. "It's getting heated out there, sir. Fox News is running segments suggesting this is an overreaction to a single incident. MSNBC is praising you as a civil rights champion. Neither is telling the complete story." "They rarely do," Johnson replied calmly. "Set up a press briefing for tomorrow morning. We need to communicate directly, not through the filter of political agendas." "Yes, sir. Also, you should know that Officer Reynolds has requested a meeting." Johnson stopped walking. "Reynolds, the officer from the checkpoint?" "The same. He reached out through proper channels, said it was personal, not official." Johnson considered this for a moment. "Schedule it for this afternoon. My office, not an interrogation room, and Michael, no recording, no witnesses, just us." Reese raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Understood." That afternoon, Officer Thomas Reynolds sat stiffly in a chair across from Johnson's desk, his uniform pressed and immaculate, his cap resting on his knee. The trappings of the FBI director's office, the flags, the seal, the photographs with world leaders, seemed to weigh on him, making him appear smaller than he had in the courtroom. "Thank you for seeing me, Director Johnson," Reynolds began, his voice betraying a nervousness absent during their previous encounters. "Of course," Johnson replied, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "What can I do for you, Officer Reynolds?" Reynolds took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize. Properly. Not because I have to, or because there's a camera rolling, but because," he hesitated, "because you were right about what you said in the courtroom." Johnson remained silent, allowing Reynolds the space to continue. "I did profile you that night. I did make assumptions. And in court, I did find it funny that you were representing yourself. None of that was professional, and all of it was wrong." Reynolds looked up, meeting Johnson's gaze directly for the first time. "I've been on the force for 12 years, and I've never had to really examine the way I approach my job. This whole situation has forced me to do that." Johnson studied the man before him, looking for signs of performance or calculation, but finding only genuine discomfort and what appeared to be sincere remorse. "I appreciate your candor, Officer Reynolds. It can't be easy to admit these things, especially to the person you wronged." "It's not," Reynolds agreed, "but it's necessary. I joined the force because I wanted to help people, to make a difference. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing some people as problems instead of citizens I'm sworn to protect." Johnson leaned forward slightly. "What do you want from this conversation, Officer Reynolds?" "Nothing," Reynolds said quickly. "I'm not here to save my job or avoid the departmental review. I just thought, if I'm going to start changing how I approach my work, owning my mistakes seemed like the right first step." A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of systems larger than both men, histories deeper than their individual experiences. "Officer Reynolds," Johnson finally said, "change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, often an uncomfortable one. But recognizing the need for that process is significant." Reynolds nodded, some of the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. "I'll tell you what," Johnson continued. "The task force we're forming will need input from officers at all levels. Not just chiefs and commissioners, but the men and women on the street. Would you be willing to participate in that dialogue?" Reynolds looked surprised. "You'd want my input? After everything that happened?" "Especially because of what happened," Johnson affirmed. "Real change requires honest voices from all sides of the issue." When Reynolds left the office, he walked differently, not with the swagger he'd displayed in court, but with the measured step of someone carrying new understanding. Deputy Director Reese, who had been waiting outside, entered with a questioning look. "How did that go?" Johnson smiled faintly. "Better than expected. We may have found an unexpected ally." "An ally? The man who arrested you?" "Sometimes, Michael, the most powerful advocates for change are those who have directly confronted their own biases." Johnson rose from his desk. "Now let's get back to work. We have a task force to build." Over the next few weeks, the Civil Rights Enforcement Task Force took shape with remarkable speed. Johnson appointed Assistant Director Chen to lead the initiative, recognizing that her background in both criminal investigation and data analysis made her uniquely qualified for the role. Teams were assembled, methodologies developed, and partnerships established with civil rights organizations, academic institutions, and law enforcement agencies willing to participate. Not everyone embraced the initiative. Several police departments publicly refused to cooperate, citing jurisdictional concerns. Conservative media outlets framed the task force as an attack on law enforcement. Some members of Congress called for hearings on what they termed executive overreach. Johnson weathered the criticism with the same calm resolve he'd displayed throughout the ordeal. In interviews, he consistently brought the conversation back to first principles: equal justice under law, constitutional protections, the fundamental right of every citizen to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of race or background. 6 weeks after the courthouse confrontation, Johnson returned to the scene of his arrest. The checkpoint was gone, the street busy with the normal flow of traffic. He stood on the sidewalk, observing the intersection where his car had been stopped, reflecting on how a seemingly routine encounter had catalyzed such significant change. His security detail maintained a discreet perimeter as he took in the surroundings. A young black man walking past did a double-take upon recognizing him. "Director Johnson?" the young man asked tentatively. Johnson smiled. "Yes, that's me." "Elijah Taylor, sir. I'm a law student at Howard University." The young man extended his hand. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you did in court and what you're doing now. It matters." Johnson shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and congratulations on law school. We need sharp legal minds committed to justice." "That's the plan, sir," Elijah replied with quiet determination. "Your case is actually the subject of my constitutional law paper this semester. Is that right? I'd be interested to read it when you're finished." Elijah's eyes widened. "Really? I mean, I'd be honored to share it with you." Johnson pulled out a business card and handed it to him. "Send it to this email when it's done. And if you're interested in the Bureau after graduation, let me know. We need people who understand these issues from lived experience." As Elijah continued on his way, visibly energized by the encounter, Johnson's security chief approached. "Ready to head back to headquarters, sir?" Johnson took one last look at the intersection. "Yes, I think we're done here." That evening, Johnson sat alone in his study at home, a rare moment of solitude in his demanding schedule. On his desk lay photographs spanning his career, from his graduation from the FBI Academy decades ago to his swearing in as director. Each image captured a milestone in a journey that had been simultaneously remarkable and challenging. His wife, Diane, entered quietly, placing a cup of tea beside him. After 30 years of marriage, she could read his contemplative moods with practiced ease. "Thinking about how far we've come, or how far we still have to go?" she asked, resting a hand on his shoulder. Johnson smiled up at her. "Both, I suppose. Today I met a young law student who reminded me of myself at that age, full of idealism and determination. It made me wonder if the work we're doing now will make his path any easier than mine was. You're creating space for change, Marcus. That matters even if results take time." She studied the photographs on his desk. "Remember what your father used to say? 'The arc is long, but it bends toward justice,'" Johnson quoted. He was paraphrasing Dr. King, of course. And he was right. Diane squeezed his shoulder gently. "Don't expect to fix everything all at once. Real change happens in increments." "Speaking of increments," Johnson said, picking up his tablet, "the preliminary data from the task force is starting to come in. They've analyzed 5 years of traffic stops across 10 major metropolitan areas. The patterns are even more pronounced than we anticipated." Diane sat beside him, examining the graphs and charts as he scrolled through the report. The statistical evidence was stark. Black and Hispanic drivers were significantly more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested than white drivers, even in areas where demographic data and crime rates didn't support such disparities. "This will make waves when it's published," Diane observed. "That's the intention," Johnson replied. "Hard data is difficult to dismiss as anecdotal or subjective. Even departments resistant to change will have to acknowledge these numbers." The following morning, Assistant Director Chen presented the preliminary findings to the task force leadership team. The conference room at FBI headquarters buzzed with focused energy as analysts, legal experts, and field agents reviewed the data projections on the large screens. "The statistical analysis confirms what many communities have been reporting for years," Chen explained, her laser pointer highlighting key data points. "But now we have the comprehensive evidence to support targeted interventions." "What's our next step?" asked Special Agent Terrell Washington, who had been seconded from the Civil Rights Unit to serve on the task force. "We've identified 20 departments with the most significant disparities," Chen replied. "Director Johnson has approved full-scale reviews of their policies, training procedures, and enforcement patterns." Special Agent Julia Morales raised her hand. "What about the departments that have refused to cooperate?" The Birmingham PD just issued a statement yesterday rejecting any unwarranted federal scrutiny. We anticipated resistance, Chen acknowledged. For non-cooperative departments, we'll be exercising our authority under existing consent decrees where applicable. In other cases, we're partnering with state attorneys general to establish legal frameworks for review. As the meeting continued, Johnson observed from the back of the room, satisfied with the team's methodical approach. This wasn't about headlines or quick victories. It was about building a sustainable foundation for systemic change. His phone vibrated with a text message from the Attorney General. Senate Judiciary Committee requesting your testimony next week. Hostile questions expected. Are you up for it? Johnson typed his reply without hesitation. Always ready to speak truth to power. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed with spectators and press when Johnson arrived the following Tuesday. He had testified before congressional committees dozens of times during his career, but the atmosphere today was particularly charged. The committee members' expressions telegraphed the partisan divide that had emerged around the task force initiative. Senator Richard Hargrove, a conservative firebrand from Alabama, led the questioning with barely disguised hostility. Director Johnson, many law enforcement professionals view this task force as a solution in search of a problem, an unnecessary federal intrusion based on a single unfortunate incident involving you personally. How do you respond to concerns that you're using your position to wage a vendetta against local police? Johnson's expression remained impassive as he leaned toward the microphone. Senator, characterizing systemic bias in law enforcement as a single unfortunate incident suggests you haven't reviewed the extensive data compiled by the Justice Department over the past decade, data that predates my appointment as director. The task force was not established in response to my personal experience. Rather, that experience highlighted the urgency of addressing well-documented patterns of inequity. Patterns according to whom? Hargrove pressed. According to rigorous statistical analysis, Senator. According to body cam footage. According to court records. According to the lived experiences of thousands of Americans. Johnson's voice remained measured but took on a subtle intensity. This isn't about emotion or politics. It's about evidence. And the evidence clearly indicates that equal protection under the law remains more aspiration than reality for many citizens. Senator Hargrove's face reddened. Director, many would argue that statistics can be manipulated to support any agenda. Law enforcement officers make split-second decisions in high-pressure situations. Monday morning quarterbacking from federal bureaucrats doesn't make their jobs any easier. With respect, Senator, ensuring constitutional policing isn't Monday morning quarterbacking. It's upholding the oath that every law enforcement officer, including myself, swears to uphold. Johnson leaned forward slightly, and I would submit that statistical patterns across thousands of interactions can't be dismissed as manipulation. When the data consistently shows that citizens of color are treated differently during routine encounters, we have a responsibility to address that disparity. The questioning continued for nearly 3 hours, alternating between hostile interrogation from conservative members and supportive inquiries from progressives. Throughout, Johnson maintained his composure, neither rising to provocations nor allowing the discussion to be reduced to partisan talking points. Senator Celia Ramirez, a former prosecutor from California, provided a moment of clarity late in the proceedings. Director Johnson, beyond the data and the policies, I'm interested in your vision. If the task force succeeds, what does success look like 5 years from now? Johnson considered the question thoughtfully. Success would mean that a citizen's race no longer predicts how they'll be treated during encounters with law enforcement. It would mean that departments nationwide have implemented evidence-based training programs to address implicit bias. It would mean accountability systems that identify and correct problematic patterns before they become entrenched. He paused, then continued with quiet conviction. Most importantly, success would mean restored trust. Communities viewing law enforcement as partners in public safety rather than occupying forces. Because effective policing requires the cooperation and confidence of the communities being served. When certain communities systematically experience unequal treatment, that trust erodes, making everyone less safe. The hearing concluded without the fireworks some had anticipated, but Johnson knew this was merely one battle in a longer campaign. As he left the Capitol, reporters shouted questions about whether he had won over skeptical senators. "This isn't about winning or losing," he told them. "It's about beginning difficult but necessary conversations about how we deliver on America's promise of equal justice." Back at FBI headquarters, the task force's work continued unabated. Teams were now embedded in 15 police departments across the country, reviewing procedures, analyzing data, and conducting interviews with officers and community members. The preliminary reports painted a complex picture. Most officers genuinely believed in fair policing, yet unconscious biases and departmental cultures often resulted in disparate outcomes. In the Metropolitan Police Department that had arrested Johnson, the review was particularly thorough. Officer Reynolds, true to his word, had become an active participant, providing candid insights into the unwritten norms and unofficial practices that influenced officer behavior. "It's not that we're explicitly told to target certain groups," Reynolds explained during an interview with Special Agent Washington. "It's more subtle than that. Success is measured by arrests and citations. Promotions go to officers with high numbers. So naturally, you focus on the easy targets, people less likely to have resources to fight charges, less likely to file complaints, less likely to have connections. And those easy targets tend to be," Washington prompted, "minorities, poor people, the ones the system already works against." Reynolds shook his head. "I never thought about it that way until recently. You just absorb the culture, follow the unspoken rules." These insights informed the task force's approach, leading to recommendations that addressed not just explicit policies, but the implicit incentive structures and cultural factors that shaped officer behavior. 3 months into the initiative, Johnson received a request that surprised him. Chief Robert Mendoza of the Metropolitan Police Department, the same department responsible for his arrest, asked for a private meeting. Johnson agreed, curious about what Mendoza might want to discuss. When the chief arrived at his office, he seemed different from the defensive, combative figure who had initially rejected the task force's authority. There was a weariness to him, but also a newfound resolve. "Thank you for seeing me, Director Johnson," Mendoza began, declining Johnson's offer of coffee. "I'll get straight to the point. I've reviewed the preliminary findings your task force has compiled about my department. I came here intending to dispute them to defend my officers." Johnson waited, sensing there was more. "But I can't," Mendoza continued, his voice quieter now. "The data is too clear, too consistent, and watching Officer Reynolds' transformation, a man I've known for years, has forced me to reconsider my own assumptions." Johnson leaned forward, genuinely surprised by the chief's candor. "That couldn't have been an easy conclusion to reach." "It wasn't," Mendoza acknowledged. "I've spent 30 years in law enforcement, Director. I joined to make a difference, to protect people. The idea that our practices might be causing harm instead, it's difficult to reconcile with how I see myself, how I see my department." "I understand that, Chief. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges our self-perception." Mendoza nodded, meeting Johnson's gaze directly. "I want to get ahead of this. Before your final report comes out, before we're forced into reforms by public pressure or court orders, I'm proposing that the Metropolitan PD become a pilot site for comprehensive reform, developed collaboratively with your task force, implemented with full departmental commitment. Johnson studied the man before him, looking for any hint of political calculation or self-preservation. Finding none, he allowed himself a small smile. That would be a significant step, Chief Mendoza. What prompted this decision? Two things, Mendoza replied. First, those statistics don't lie. When I saw the traffic stop numbers broken down by race, time of day, and officer, patterns emerged that I can't ignore or explain away. And the second? My granddaughter. Mendoza's expression softened. She's 6, biracial. Her father, my son-in-law, is black. Last week she asked him why police officers only stop people who look like her daddy. He shook his head slowly. That hit me hard, Director. I realized I don't want her growing up in a world where that's her perception of the profession I've dedicated my life to. Johnson nodded, understanding the personal dimension that often underpinned professional epiphanies. Your proposal aligns perfectly with our approach, Chief. We're not interested in punitive measures or public shaming. We want partners committed to meaningful change. By the time Mendoza left, they had outlined the framework for what would become the Metropolitan Police Department Transformation Initiative, a comprehensive program that would serve as a model for departments nationwide. The pilot would include revised training protocols, new accountability mechanisms, community oversight provisions, and modified performance metrics that emphasized quality of policing over quantity of arrests. Not everyone embraced the initiative. When Mendoza presented the plan to his command staff, the resistance was immediate and vehement. This is capitulation, plain and simple, argued Deputy Chief Wilson, his face flushed with anger. You're throwing our officers under the bus to appease political pressure. I'm doing nothing of the sort, Mendoza countered firmly. I'm acknowledging reality, Dave. The data doesn't lie. We have systemic issues that need addressing. Data can be manipulated, Wilson insisted. And even if there are disparities, that doesn't automatically mean bias. Different communities, different crime patterns. It's more complex than these bureaucrats understand. The Police Officers Association was equally opposed. Its president, Frank Moretti, issued a scathing statement characterizing the initiative as a surrender to anti-police sentiment and warning that it would hamstring officers' ability to make split-second decisions in potentially life-threatening situations. Johnson had anticipated this resistance. In a strategic move, he arranged for a forum that brought together officers like Reynolds, who supported reform, community leaders from affected neighborhoods, and legal experts who could address concerns about officer liability and safety. The forum, held at Howard University Law School, provided a platform for constructive dialogue rather than polarized debate. Johnson deliberately kept a low profile, allowing Chief Mendoza to take the lead in presenting the initiative to the community and his own officers. I understand the concerns on both sides, Mendoza told the audience. My officers worry that additional scrutiny will make an already difficult job impossible. Community members worry that promises of reform will prove empty. But I believe we share a common goal: safe communities where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. In the audience, Elijah Taylor sat with a group of fellow law students, taking detailed notes. When the floor opened for questions, he was among the first to approach the microphone. Chief Mendoza, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge these issues, Elijah began. But acknowledgement without accountability isn't enough. What specific mechanisms will ensure that officers who continue discriminatory practices face consequences? Mendoza nodded, recognizing the essential question. That's a critical component of the initiative. We're establishing an independent review board with real authority, not just to recommend actions, but to implement them. The board will include community representatives, civil rights attorneys, and law enforcement professionals from outside our department. From his seat at the side of the auditorium, Johnson watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Young voices like Elijah's were crucial to the dialogue, pushing for substantive change while remaining engaged in the process. As the forum continued, something remarkable began to happen. Officers who had arrived defensive and skeptical started to listen as community members shared personal experiences of discriminatory treatment. Community activists who had come prepared for confrontation found themselves acknowledging the challenges officers faced in high-crime areas. Officer Reynolds, speaking near the end of the session, offered perhaps the most powerful perspective. "A few months ago, I would have been sitting here angry, feeling attacked. But what I've learned through this process is that examining our practices doesn't mean condemning all police work. It means making us better at our jobs, which is protecting and serving everyone equally." The forum made headlines across the region, presenting a model for productive engagement that contrasted sharply with the polarized debates playing out on cable news. Johnson leveraged the positive coverage to secure additional support for similar initiatives in other cities. By the 6-month mark of the task force's work, pilot programs were underway in 23 police departments nationwide. The preliminary data showed promising results. Departments implementing the recommended reforms had seen decreases in use-of-force incidents and civilian complaints, alongside improved clearance rates for serious crimes. Not all the news was positive, however. In several cities, entrenched resistance from police unions had stalled progress. Political pressure continued from both sides, conservatives accusing the FBI of overreach, progressives demanding faster and more sweeping changes. Johnson navigated these challenges with strategic patience, understanding that lasting change required sustained effort rather than dramatic gestures. In his weekly meetings with task force leadership, he emphasized the importance of documentation, measurement, and persistence. "We're not looking for quick headlines or symbolic victories," he reminded the team. "We're building infrastructure for generational change. That means withstanding criticism from all sides while keeping our focus on the long-term objectives." One unexpected development came from Johnson's connection with Elijah Taylor. After reading the law student's paper on constitutional policing, Johnson had invited him to participate in a summer internship program with the task force. Elijah's perspective as both a law student and a young black man provided valuable insights into how the initiative's recommendations would be received by communities most affected by discriminatory policing. "Director Johnson," Elijah said during a feedback session, "one thing I've noticed is that much of our communication is filtered through community leaders who tend to be older. But young people's experiences with police are often different and more frequent. We need targeted outreach to younger community members." Johnson nodded thoughtfully. "Good observation. What would you suggest?" "Social media engagement for one, but also forums specifically in high schools, community colleges, youth centers, and not just presentations, interactive sessions where young people can speak directly to officers and task force members." The suggestion led to the development of the Youth Engagement Initiative, which quickly became one of the most successful components of the broader reform effort. High school and college students in participating communities were invited to contribute to policy development, participate in officer training sessions, and help design new approaches to community policing. For Johnson personally, the work remained both challenging and deeply fulfilling. The long hours and constant political pressure took their toll, but the signs of progress, however incremental, provided sustaining energy. 1 year after Johnson's courthouse confrontation, the FBI published its comprehensive report on policing practices nationwide. The document, meticulously researched and rigorously fact-checked, presented an unflinching assessment of systemic disparities while also highlighting promising reforms and successful interventions. The report's release generated precisely the national conversation Johnson had hoped for: thoughtful, evidence-based, and focused on solutions rather than recriminations. Major news outlets devoted significant coverage to the findings. Editorial boards across the political spectrum acknowledged the need for reform, though they differed on approaches. And police departments that had initially resisted review began requesting assistance implementing the report's recommendations. At FBI headquarters, Johnson convened a meeting to mark the milestone and chart the path forward. The conference room buzzed with energy as task force members shared updates from their respective regions. The Seattle pilot program has exceeded expectations, reported Special Agent Morales. Use of force incidents are down 32%, civilian complaints have decreased by 41%, and officer morale has actually improved according to internal surveys. What about crime rates? Johnson asked, anticipating the question that critics would inevitably raise. That's the most encouraging part, Morales replied. Violent crime is down 7%, and clearance rates for homicides have increased by 12%. The data directly contradicts the narrative that accountability undermines effective policing. Similar reports came from Chicago, Atlanta, Denver, and other cities where comprehensive reforms had been implemented. Not every location showed equal progress. Entrenched resistance in some departments had slowed implementation, and a few pilot programs had encountered unexpected challenges, but the overall trajectory was undeniably positive. We should acknowledge Officer Reynolds' contribution, Johnson said as the meeting concluded. His willingness to speak candidly about his own evolution has been particularly effective in reaching officers initially resistant to change. Indeed, Reynolds had emerged as an unexpected ambassador for the reform movement. His transformation from skeptic to advocate carried special credibility with fellow officers who recognized him as one of their own rather than an outsider imposing change. He had begun traveling to police academies nationwide, sharing his experience and challenging cadets to examine their own biases before they solidified into practice. After the meeting, Johnson found a moment to check in with Elijah Taylor, whose summer internship had evolved into a part-time position during his final year of law school. "How are your classes going?" Johnson asked as they walked toward the elevator. "Challenging but good," Elijah replied. "My constitutional law professor keeps using the task force's work as a case study. It's strange being the only student who's actually involved in the initiative we're discussing." Johnson smiled. "I imagine that gives you a unique perspective." "It does. And it's making me reconsider my career plans." Elijah hesitated, then continued. "I always assumed I'd join a civil rights organization after graduation, but seeing change happen from within the system, it's making me think about paths I hadn't considered before. Such as, maybe the Bureau, if you're still hiring by then," Elijah said with a small smile, "or the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, places where I could help implement the reforms we're developing now." Johnson nodded thoughtfully. "We need sharp minds committed to these principles in every institution, Elijah. I'd be happy to discuss options when you're closer to graduation." As Johnson left headquarters that evening, his security detail escorted him to the waiting SUV. A small group of protesters had gathered across the street, about 20 people holding signs with slogans like "Back the Blue" and "Stop FBI Overreach." Johnson paused, observing them briefly. His security chief tensed. "Sir, we should keep moving." "One moment," Johnson replied, then approached the barricade separating him from the protesters. A few lowered their signs, seemingly surprised by his direct engagement. "Good evening," Johnson said. "I see you have concerns about our work. I'd be interested in hearing them directly if you're willing to share." The protesters exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, a middle-aged man in a police support t-shirt stepped forward. "We think your task force is undermining law enforcement," he stated flatly. "Making their jobs harder, making communities less safe." Johnson nodded. "I understand that concern. Have you had a chance to review the data from our pilot programs?" "Data can be manipulated," the man replied, echoing a common criticism. It can, Johnson agreed. That's why we've published our complete methodology and raw data sets for independent verification. But beyond the numbers, I'd ask you to consider this. The departments implementing these reforms are reporting improved community cooperation, better intelligence gathering, and higher clearance rates for serious crimes. Isn't that what we all want? Effective policing that keeps everyone safe? The man frowned, clearly not expecting this measured response. Maybe, but officers feel like they're being painted as villains. That's never been our intention, Johnson said sincerely. The vast majority of law enforcement officers are committed professionals doing difficult work. Our goal is to provide them with better tools, training, and support to ensure they can serve all communities equally. If our messaging has suggested otherwise, that's something we need to address. The brief exchange didn't change any minds immediately, but it demonstrated Johnson's unwavering commitment to dialogue even with critics, a commitment that had become a hallmark of the initiative's approach. The following week, Johnson received an unexpected invitation from the White House. The president wanted him to co-chair a national commission on policing standards, expanding the task force's work into a more permanent framework for ongoing reform. This would elevate the work beyond the FBI, the president explained during their meeting in the Oval Office. Create something that transcends administrations and partisan shifts. You've proven the concept works. Now let's institutionalize it. Johnson considered the proposal carefully. It would require bipartisan support to be sustainable, Mr. President. Given the current political climate, that won't be easy to secure. I've already spoken with Senator Hartman, the president replied, referring to a moderate Republican respected on both sides of the aisle. He's cautiously supportive, especially after seeing the results in cities in his state. He's willing to co-sponsor the legislation if we can address certain concerns about local control and officer protections. Those are legitimate considerations we've been working to balance all along, Johnson acknowledged. I'd be honored to serve on the commission, Mr. President, but I'd suggest including Chief Mendoza as well. Having an experienced police administrator would add valuable perspective and credibility. The announcement of the National Commission on Equitable Policing generated a new wave of media attention. Johnson found himself conducting back-to-back interviews, testifying before congressional committees, and addressing law enforcement conferences across the country. Through it all, he maintained his focus on evidence-based solutions rather than ideological positions. When progressive activists criticized the commission for not going far enough, Johnson invited them to submit specific recommendations supported by data. When conservative commentators accused the commission of being anti-police, he highlighted the improvements in officer safety and job satisfaction in departments that had embraced reforms. This isn't about politics, he repeated in interview after interview. It's about constitutional policing that serves and protects everyone equally. That shouldn't be a partisan issue. The commission's work proceeded methodically, building on the foundation established by the task force. Regional hearings brought together diverse stakeholders, officers and community members, researchers and activists, prosecutors and defense attorneys, to develop comprehensive standards that balanced accountability with practical considerations of policing. Amidst this national work, Johnson made a point of staying connected to the case that had catalyzed the movement. He occasionally checked in with Officer Reynolds, whose continued evolution exemplified the potential for individual growth when systemic issues were honestly confronted. During one such conversation over coffee near the Metropolitan Police Department headquarters, Reynolds shared a revelation that had particularly affected him. Last month, I pulled over a driver for a broken taillight, Reynolds recounted. Middle-aged black man in a basic sedan. Before your case, I'd have approached with my hand near my weapon, immediately asked for license and registration, maybe even called for backup based on nothing but a feeling. "And now," Johnson prompted. I approached normally, explained the reason for the stop right away, and asked if he was aware of the taillight. Turns out he was a doctor heading home from a late shift at the hospital. We had a brief, respectful interaction. He thanked me for letting him know about the light. I thanked him for his medical service. The whole stop took maybe 3 minutes. Reynolds shook his head slowly. Afterward, I kept thinking about how differently that might have gone before, how I might have created tension where none needed to exist, how that tension could have escalated. How many thousands of interactions like that happen every day, and how many go wrong unnecessarily? Johnson nodded, recognizing the profound nature of such seemingly small shifts in approach. That's exactly the change we're working toward, not just in policies and procedures, but in the fundamental mindset of policing. 18 months after Johnson's courthouse confrontation, the National Commission presented its final recommendations to Congress. The comprehensive framework included model legislation for states, standardized training protocols, accountability mechanisms, and funding provisions to support departments transitioning to new approaches. The legislative battle that followed was intense. Police unions mobilized against provisions they viewed as threatening officer autonomy, while civil rights organizations pushed for even stronger accountability measures. Conservative media framed the Commission's work as federal overreach, while progressive outlets criticized perceived compromises. Johnson navigated this political minefield with characteristic equanimity, testifying before multiple congressional committees and meeting privately with key stakeholders from across the spectrum. His approach remained consistent, focusing on evidence rather than ideology, emphasizing shared goals rather than partisan divisions. This framework wasn't developed in an ivory tower, he explained during a particularly contentious Senate hearing. It was built from the ground up, incorporating input from officers on patrol, community members, legal experts, and empirical research. We've tested these approaches in departments of all sizes across the country, and the results speak for themselves. When Senator Hargrove, still a vocal critic, demanded to know why the Commission hadn't included stronger protections for officers making split-second decisions, Johnson's response was measured but firm. "Senator, the framework explicitly acknowledges the difficulties officers face in rapidly evolving situations. Section 4 details specific provisions for context-sensitive review of use-of-force incidents. But we must balance that understanding with the constitutional rights of all citizens. An approach that prioritizes officer convenience over constitutional protections fails to serve either the public or the officers themselves." Despite the partisan rancor in Washington, a modified version of the Commission's recommendations eventually passed with bipartisan support, a testament to Johnson's relentless bridge building and the undeniable success of the pilot programs. President Ellis signed the Equitable Policing Standards Act into law during a ceremony that brought together an unlikely coalition of law enforcement leaders, civil rights advocates, and community representatives. As Johnson stood on the dais in the Rose Garden, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The national spotlight now focused on the landmark legislation, but his thoughts were on the individual transformations that had made it possible, from Officer Reynolds to Chief Mendoza to countless others who had found the courage to question ingrained practices and embrace change. The legislation represented a beginning rather than an end, a framework that would require ongoing commitment to implement effectively. Johnson harbored no illusions about the challenges ahead, but he also recognized the significance of establishing national standards after decades of piecemeal, crisis-driven reforms. Not everyone shared in the celebration, of course. The day after the signing ceremony, Johnson's security team intercepted a credible death threat, one of several that had emerged as his profile rose. While such threats were part of the job for an FBI director, These carried a more personal animus, often laced with racial epithets and accusations of betraying law enforcement. Johnson didn't publicly acknowledge the threats, but he discussed them privately with Diane over dinner at their home. "I worry sometimes," she admitted, her hand covering his on the table. "There are people who see what you're doing as an existential threat to their worldview." "I know," Johnson replied, "but we can't let fear dictate our actions. The work is too important." Diane smiled, though concern still shadowed her eyes. "That's what you always say. Just promise me you'll continue taking the security protocols seriously." "Always," he assured her. "Besides, I have the best protective detail in the business." As implementation of the new standards began nationwide, Johnson maintained his practice of personal engagement with departments undergoing transition. During a visit to the Chicago Police Department, one of the largest agencies implementing the new framework, he encountered both progress and lingering resistance. "Some of my officers still see this as punishment," admitted Superintendent Gloria Martinez as she walked Johnson through their newly established training center. "They feel like they're being blamed for historical problems they didn't create." "That's a common reaction," Johnson acknowledged. "How are you addressing it?" "We've found that peer-to-peer communication works best. Officers who've embraced the changes talking to those who are resistant. Data helps too, showing them that departments implementing these standards are seeing fewer civilian complaints, fewer lawsuits, and actually solving more crimes." "That aligns with our national findings," Johnson said. "Change takes time, but empirical results eventually overcome emotional resistance." Later that day, Johnson met with a group of community organizers who had been instrumental in pushing for reform in Chicago's policing practices. Their perspective offered a necessary counterbalance to the departmental view. "We appreciate the progress," said Marcus Williams, director of a Southside community organization. "But there's still a huge trust deficit. Decades of mistreatment don't get erased with new policies, no matter how well-intentioned." "I understand that," Johnson replied. "Trust has to be earned through consistent action over time." "What would help bridge that gap from your perspective?" "More officers who actually live in our neighborhoods would be a start," Williams suggested. "And continued community involvement in oversight. Not just advisory committees with no real power, but meaningful participation in policy development and accountability mechanisms." Johnson nodded, making notes. "Those are excellent points that align with our recommendations. I'd like to connect you directly with Superintendent Martinez to ensure your input is incorporated into their implementation plan." This approach, bringing together institutional leaders and community voices, had become a hallmark of Johnson's methodology. He understood that sustainable change required both top-down policy reform and bottom-up community engagement. As the one-year anniversary of the legislation approached, Johnson commissioned a comprehensive assessment of its impact. The resulting report documented significant improvements in departments that had fully implemented the new standards, including a 28% reduction in use of force incidents, a 35% decrease in civilian complaints, a 22% increase in successful prosecutions for violent crimes, improved officer retention in departments that had initially faced resistance, measurable improvements in community perception of police legitimacy. The report also highlighted ongoing challenges, regional disparities in implementation, funding constraints for smaller departments, and pockets of entrenched resistance in certain agencies. Johnson insisted on including these challenges rather than presenting an artificially positive picture. "We serve truth, not agenda," he reminded the assessment team. "Acknowledging where we still need improvement strengthens our credibility, not weakens it." During this period, Johnson continued his mentorship of Elijah Taylor, who was now in his final semester of law school and preparing for the bar exam. Their regular conversations had evolved from formal guidance to a genuine friendship based on mutual respect. I've been accepted to the Justice Department's honors program, Elijah shared during one of their meetings. Civil Rights Division. That's excellent news, Johnson said warmly. They'll be fortunate to have you. I also received an offer from the Bureau, Elijah added with a small smile. The recruitment office reached out after my internship evaluation. I may have mentioned your potential to them, Johnson acknowledged, but the offer would be based entirely on your qualifications, not my recommendation. Elijah nodded, thoughtful. I'm still deciding. Both paths would allow me to contribute to the work we've started, just from different angles. Take your time, Johnson advised. Both are honorable choices. What matters is that young leaders like you are engaging with these institutions, bringing fresh perspectives and commitment to constitutional principles. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from Johnson's assistant. A situation was developing in Baltimore, one of the cities where reform implementation had been particularly contentious. A protest following a controversial police shooting had escalated into a confrontation between demonstrators and officers. Both community leaders and the police commissioner were requesting Johnson's presence as a neutral mediator respected by both sides. I need to go, Johnson told Elijah, already rising from his chair. This is exactly the kind of flashpoint that can either set back progress or demonstrate its value. Elijah nodded in understanding. Be safe, Director Johnson. Always, Johnson replied with a reassuring smile. And Elijah, whatever path you choose, remember that the most important changes happen in moments of crisis. That's when principles are tested and institutions either evolve or calcify. As Johnson's SUV sped toward Andrews Air Force Base, where a jet waited to take him to Baltimore, he reviewed the preliminary reports on his tablet. The situation was tense, but not yet violent, a critical juncture where the right intervention might prevent escalation. The Baltimore situation teetered on the edge of chaos when Johnson arrived. Protesters had gathered outside the Western District Police Station, their numbers growing as night fell. Officers in riot gear formed a perimeter around the building, their faces obscured behind shields and helmets. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by chants and occasional shouts. Johnson's security detail initially objected to his plan to walk directly into this volatile scene, but he was resolute. I didn't come to observe from a distance, he told them. I came to engage. As he approached, flanked by Baltimore Police Commissioner Daniels and community leader Reverend Williams, a momentary hush fell over the crowd. Johnson's presence, the FBI director himself arriving to address a local incident, signaled the gravity with which this situation was being treated. I'm here to listen, Johnson began, his voice carrying across the square without the need for amplification, not to impose solutions, but to ensure that both justice and truth are served in this moment. Over the next several hours, Johnson facilitated a remarkable dialogue. In a community center adjacent to the police station, he brought together protest organizers, police leadership, witnesses to the shooting, and local officials. Rather than rushing to judgment or placating either side, he insisted on a methodical, transparent process. We will review the body cam footage together, he announced. We will hear from witnesses, we will examine evidence, and we will ensure that this investigation proceeds with absolute integrity. The approach diffused the immediate tension. By morning, the protesters had disbanded, not because their concerns had been dismissed, but because they had been genuinely heard and a clear process for accountability had been established. Officers returned to regular uniforms, removing the militarized presence that had escalated tensions. Before leaving Baltimore, Johnson spoke privately with the family of Devin Williams, the young man who had been shot during the police encounter. I can't promise you a specific outcome, he told Williams' parents with quiet honesty, but I can promise you a thorough, unbiased investigation. Your son's case will not be forgotten or minimized. The Baltimore intervention became a model for crisis response. demonstrating how the principles established by the Equitable Policing Standards Act could be applied in real time to prevent the escalation that had characterized so many previous incidents. In the months that followed, Johnson maintained his dual focus, implementing systemic reforms while responding to individual cases that threatened to undermine progress. His calendar reflected this balance: congressional testimony one day, community forums the next, police academy addresses followed by meetings with families affected by misconduct. 2 years after his courthouse confrontation, Johnson was preparing to transition from his role as FBI director. His statutory 10-year term wasn't complete, but he had come to believe that the reform movement needed to be institutionalized beyond his personal leadership. "The changes we've implemented must outlast any individual," he explained to the president. "By stepping aside now and ensuring continuity of leadership, we demonstrate that this isn't about me. It's about lasting structural reform." The president reluctantly accepted Johnson's decision. "You've transformed not just the Bureau but the entire landscape of American policing," he acknowledged during their private meeting. "Who do you recommend as your successor?" Johnson didn't hesitate. "Deputy Director Reese has been integral to every aspect of our reform initiative. He has the vision to continue this work and the operational experience to maintain the Bureau's effectiveness across all its mandates." As news of Johnson's planned departure became public, reflections on his legacy dominated media coverage. Even former critics acknowledged the measurable improvements in policing practices nationwide, though debates continued about specific aspects of implementation. Johnson himself focused on completing key initiatives before his departure. He wanted to ensure that the accountability mechanisms, training protocols, and community engagement practices developed under his leadership were fully integrated into institutional structures. 1 month before his official departure date, Johnson returned to the Metropolitan Courthouse, the scene where his journey had begun. The building looked the same, its stone facade and formal corridors unchanged, but the practices within had transformed significantly. Judge Harrington, still presiding in the same courtroom, welcomed him warmly. "Director Johnson, what brings you back to my humble domain?" "Closure, perhaps," Johnson replied with a small smile, "and a desire to witness the changes firsthand." He spent the day observing proceedings, noting the differences in how defendants were treated, how evidence was presented, and how officers testified. The systemic bias hadn't been completely eliminated. Such deep-rooted problems never vanished overnight, but the improvement was undeniable. Officers now wore body cameras as standard practice. Defense counsel had immediate access to all evidence, including footage. Judges received implicit bias training. Independent review boards evaluated patterns in arrests and prosecutions. Each individual change might seem modest in isolation, but collectively they created a fundamentally more equitable system. That evening, Johnson hosted a small gathering at his home, a private acknowledgement of the journey shared with those who had been part of it from the beginning. Diane had arranged everything with her usual thoughtfulness, creating a space for reflection rather than formal celebration. Chief Mendoza was there, now a national advocate for police reform. Officer Reynolds attended as well, recently promoted to sergeant and responsible for training new officers in constitutional policing practices. Director Reynolds from the Civil Rights Division came, along with key members of the task force and commission. And Elijah Taylor, who had accepted the position with the Justice Department, but maintained his connection to the Bureau through ongoing consultation, arrived with news of his own. "I've been appointed to the Oversight Committee for the Baltimore Consent Decree," he shared with Johnson. "My first major assignment with the division." "They couldn't have made a better choice," Johnson replied, genuine pride in his voice. "You bring both the legal expertise and the lived experience needed for that role." As the evening progressed, The conversation naturally turned to reflections on how far they had come and the challenges that remained. "We've made structural changes," Mendoza observed, "but culture is harder to transform. Some officers still resist the new approaches, seeing them as constraints rather than improvements." "That's why leadership matters so much," Reynolds added. "When sergeants and lieutenants embrace these principles, patrol officers follow suit. When they resist, even the best policies get undermined in daily practice." Johnson listened attentively, appreciating their candor. "This was always going to be generational work," he acknowledged. "We've laid the foundation. Now it's about building on it consistently, regardless of political shifts or media attention." As the gathering wound down, Johnson found himself on his back porch with Elijah, both men gazing out at the night sky. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have gone?" Elijah asked. "If you hadn't been the one stopped at that checkpoint, if you hadn't had the position to drive change afterward?" Johnson considered the question carefully. "I think about all the people who experienced what I did, but lacked the platform to make their voices heard. Their stories matter just as much as mine, even if they didn't make headlines. That's why this work can't stop," Elijah said with quiet determination. "Because there are still so many unheard voices." Johnson nodded. "Exactly. And that's why I'm so heartened by leaders like you stepping into these roles. The next chapter belongs to your generation." On his final day as FBI director, Johnson addressed the entire bureau from the courtyard of headquarters. Hundreds of agents and staff gathered to hear his parting words, with thousands more watching via secure live stream from field offices nationwide. "When I stood in that courtroom 3 years ago, I made a choice," Johnson told them. "I could have used my position to avoid consequences, or I could use that moment to illuminate a systemic problem. I chose the latter because I believe in the institutions we serve, even when they fall short of their ideals." He surveyed the assembled faces, diverse in ways the Bureau hadn't been when he first joined decades earlier. "The true measure of our commitment to justice isn't how we treat the powerful or the privileged. It's how we treat those without power or privilege. It's whether we recognize the humanity in every person we encounter. It's whether we apply the law equally, regardless of race, background, or appearance." Johnson's voice strengthened as he delivered his final message. "The work we've begun transcends any individual. It belongs to all of us who believe that America's promise of equal justice under law must be more than words engraved on a courthouse pediment. It must be a living reality experienced by every citizen in every encounter with those sworn to protect and serve." As applause rose around him, Johnson felt both the weight of what had been accomplished and the gravity of what remained to be done. The path forward would not be without obstacles, resistance, or setbacks, but he had witnessed firsthand how moments of crisis could become catalysts for transformation, how systems could bend toward justice when enough determined hands applied pressure at the right points. The courthouse confrontation that had begun this journey was now part of a larger story, one still being written in police departments, courtrooms, and communities across the nation. Johnson had contributed his chapter. Now others would continue the narrative, building on the foundation laid through confrontation, collaboration, and unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. As he stepped away from the podium, Johnson carried with him the knowledge that the most meaningful change wasn't measured in legislation or policies, but in shifted perspectives, transformed practices, and restored trust. The work would continue, as it must, unfinished but undeniably advanced, imperfect but irrevocably improved.